Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 2 of our Doubt It series. So, have you ever seen the movie Zootopia? If you haven't, let me fill you in because I want to show you a clip. Judy Hopps is a rabbit, the first rabbit to ever join the police force of Zootopia. It's not an easy job, but Judy is committed to solving a mysterious case where formerly intelligent animals seem to be turning savage. Watch what happens as Judy makes a break in the big case.
Well, this should be good.
I thought this was just a missing mammal case, but it's way bigger. Mr. Otterton did not just disappear. I believe he and this jaguar, they went savage, sir.
Savage? This isn't the Stone Age, Hops. Animals don't go savage.
I thought so too. Till I saw this. What? He was right here!
The savage jaguar?
Sir, I know what I saw. He almost killed us.
Or maybe any aggressive predator looks savage to you rabbits. Let's go!
Wait, sir. I'm not the only one who saw him. Nick.
You think I'm going to believe a fox?
Well, he was a key witness, and I enlisted...
2 days to find the otter. Or you quit. That was the deal. Badge.
But, sir, we...
Badge!
So Judy discovered an important clue in this case, but she's struggling to convince her boss about what she's found. Her evidence has gone missing. If you've seen the movie, you know that we're meant to side with Judy, because we've seen the same evidence that she'd seen. But in real life, I understand where Chief Bogo is coming from. Evidence is important. So my sister once told me of a place her and her boyfriend like to eat at in Minneapolis. Sounds like a normal conversation, right? Wrong. Apparently this place was a restaurant with a grocery store, deli, bakery, and a butcher shop, all in one place. When she said that, I didn't believe her and envisioned something like an outdoor mall where they are all separate buildings, but all in one strip. I needed to see the evidence to believe it. And boy, was I wrong. This place actually exists. And it's pretty cool since there are a ton of different cultures that shop and eat there. It's called the Holy Land. So, was there ever a time that you needed to prove something to someone? Or have you ever asked someone to prove something to you? What's one situation where you'd want to see evidence before making a decision or a judgment? And what's a situation where you'd be willing to believe something without seeing all of the evidence? Is it ever okay to ask God for evidence before we believe or obey Him? Why or why not? Pause this and spend some time thinking about these questions and talking about them with those around you. In nearly every area of our lives, investigating and fact-checking others' claims is not only reasonable, it's celebrated. But when it comes to our faith, asking for evidence, investigating, and fact-checking is sometimes looked down upon or even shamed. Some people talk about faith in God as if faith means blind trust, but I disagree. Having faith in God doesn't mean that we can't also have evidence that supports what we believe. Today we're going to continue our conversation about doubts and questions. Last week we said that you're not alone in your questions, and this week we're going to talk more about our questions and how God responds when people ask for evidence before they choose to believe. First, I want to introduce to you a man named Gideon. At the time of this story, Gideon's people, the Israelites, were suffering under the oppression of a nation called Midian. They were frustrated, afraid, and desperate. God's people cried out for help, and in response, God sent an angel to Gideon to say God was still with Israel. But Gideon had a few questions. Then the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hands of Midian 7 years. The power of Midian prevailed against Israel. Because of Midian, the sons of Israel made for themselves the dens which were in the mountains and in the caves and the strongholds. For it was when Israel had sown that the Midianites would come up with the Amalekites and the sons of the east and go against them. So they would camp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, as well as no sheep, ox, or donkey. For they would come up with their livestock in their tents. They would come in like locusts for number. Both they and their camels were innumerable. And they came into the land to devastate it. So Israel was brought very low because of Midian. And the sons of Israel cried to the Lord. Then the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord gave them into the hands of Midian. Oh, I'm just reading that, sorry. Now it came about when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord on account of Midian, that the Lord sent a prophet to the sons of Israel, and he said to them, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, It is I who brought you up from Egypt, and brought you out of the house of slavery. I delivered you from the hands of the Egyptians, and from the hands of all your oppressors, and dispossessed them before you, and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you live. But you have not obeyed me. Then the angel of the Lord came and sat under the oak that was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, and his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress in order to save it from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, The Lord is with you, O valiant warrior. Then Gideon said to him, O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hands of Midian. The Lord looked at him and said, Go in this your strength and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. Have I not sent you? He said to him, O Lord, how shall I deliver Israel? Behold, my family is the least in Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's house. But the Lord said to him, Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat Midian as one man. So Gideon said to him, If now I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who speaks with me. Please do not depart from here until I come back to you, and bring out my offering and lay it before you. And he said, I will remain until you return. Then Gideon went in and prepared a young goat and unleavened bread from an ephah of flour. He put the meat in a basket and the broth in a pot, and brought them out to him under the oak and presented them. The angel of God said to him, Take the meat and the unleavened bread and lay them on this rock, and pour out the broth. He did so. Then the angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand, and touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire sprang up from the rock, and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. Then the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. When Gideon saw that he was the angel of the Lord, he said, Alas, O Lord God, for now I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. The Lord said to him, Peace to you, do not fear, you shall not die. Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord, and named it The Lord is Peace. To this day, it is still in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Now on the same night, the Lord said to him, "Take your father's bull, and a second bull 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal, which belongs to your father, and cut down the Asherah that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on the top of this stronghold in an orderly manner. And take a second bull and offer a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah, which you shall cut down." Then Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as the Lord had spoken to him. And because he was too afraid of his father's household and the men of the city to do it by day, he did it by night. When the men of the city arose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was torn down, and the Asherah which was beside it was cut down, and the second bull was offered on the altar, which had been built. They said to one another, "Who did this thing?" And when they searched about and inquired, they said, "Gideon the son of Joash did this thing." Then the men of the city said to Joash, "Bring out your son, that he may die, for he has torn down the altar of Baal. And indeed, he has cut down the Asherah which was beside it." But Joash said to all who stood against him, "Will you contend for Baal, or will you deliver him? Whoever will plead for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because someone has torn down his altar." Therefore on that day he named him Jerubbaal, that is to say, "Let Baal contend against him," because he had torn down his altar. Then all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the sons of the east assembled themselves, and they crossed over and camped in the valley of Jezreel. So the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and the Abiezrites were called together to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, and they also were called together to follow him. And he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they came up to meet them. Then Gideon said to God, "If you will deliver Israel through me, as you have spoken, behold, I will put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all ground, then I will know that you will deliver Israel through me, as you have spoken." And it was so. When he arose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he drained the dew from the fleece, a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, "Do not let your anger burn against me, that I may speak once more. Please let me make a test once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, and let there be dew on all the ground." God did so that night, for it was dry only on the fleece, and dew was on all the ground. In this story, Gideon questions and asks God for proof 5 times before he's convinced. This story might be shocking or confusing to you if you've ever been told that if you had faith, you wouldn't need to ask God for proof of anything, that asking God for your answers or evidence means that you're lacking faith, that it's wrong or shameful to question God. If that's what you've been told, you might see Gideon's behavior here as embarrassing or shameful. But if you were here last week, we learned that it's natural to ask questions. When our questions are directed toward God, like in Gideon's case, God doesn't get angry. In fact, it seems like God is pretty understanding. So a couple more questions. Do you agree or relate with Gideon and his interactions with God? Do you think God always gives evidence as clearly as he did in this story? What are some examples of times we might ask God to give us evidence today? And what might it mean if we ask God for evidence, but don't receive it in the way we were asking or expecting? So take a moment, pause the video, and answer those questions with yourself or those around you. So now that we've talked about Gideon, let's take a look at another guy who is often used as an example of not having faith and doubting God. He even earned himself the nickname Doubting Thomas. Let's see if God was as understanding to Thomas as God was to Gideon. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, who was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples were saying to him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the imprint of the nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." After 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas was with them. Jesus came, the doors having been shut, and stood in their midst and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Reach here with your finger and see my hands, and reach here with your hand and put it into my side, and do not be unbelieving, but believing." Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Because you have seen me, have you believed? Blessed are they who did not see and yet believed." So here's what's happening. Jesus has just been crucified, and the disciples were devastated. Imagine, these people thought Jesus had come to save them, but then he died. Jesus' followers were mourning, afraid, and probably a little ashamed to think that maybe they'd been wrong about everything. But then days after his death, stories started to spread that people have seen Jesus. People were understandably pretty excited. Then Jesus shows up to see all of his disciples, that is, everyone except Thomas. So when the other disciples tell Thomas that Jesus is back from the dead, he's skeptical. I'd probably be skeptical too, because dead people usually just stay dead. This news was so unbelievable that Thomas says he'll only believe if he not only sees, but can put his finger through the wounds in Jesus' flesh. That's pretty gross, but okay, Thomas. Then look what happens. Jesus shows up. Did Jesus get angry at Thomas for not having more faith? No. Did Jesus punish Thomas for not believing the news immediately? No. Did Jesus shame Thomas for his questions and doubts? No. Did Jesus do what Thomas asked? Yes. He showed his scars and let Thomas touch them. Have you ever felt like Thomas, unable to fully believe in Jesus, even though other people are totally convinced? How does it make you feel to hear that God doesn't shame or punish us for asking for evidence before we believe? I'm sure Thomas wasn't the only disciple who needed evidence to believe in Jesus' resurrection, but he's the only disciple we know of who asked for it. The book of John, where we read the story of Thomas, was written about 50 years ago, 50 years after Jesus ascended into heaven. Sorry, not 50 years ago. So it was written to a community of Jesus' followers who had never seen Jesus in the flesh. Even those early believers needed reassurance that Jesus really did rise again. It must have been so comforting to see Thomas asking the same kind of questions they might have been asking 50 years later. Jesus' words to Thomas must have resonated deeply with them too. Jesus told Thomas he got to see Jesus in the flesh, but that there would be a future of followers of Jesus who would not get that privilege. Jesus said future believers would have to base their belief on other kinds of evidence, and they'd be blessed for it. This story of Thomas demanding evidence isn't shameful. It's essential. Through Thomas's interactions with Jesus, we see that Jesus knew his future followers would need proof, evidence, and eyewitness accounts that he did indeed rise from the dead. The stories of Gideon and Thomas are only two stories in Scripture where followers of God asked for evidence before believing what they'd heard about God was true. Although it might be surprising, in both of these stories, here's what we can learn. God doesn't shame us for our questions. Instead, God gives us the evidence we need in order to believe. Some of us are more skeptical than others. If you've ever taken a personality test, you know that we all function a little bit differently. These tests tell us about all of the ways we are different and unique. Some of us are more introverted. Others are more extroverted. Some of us like to take charge, and others like to follow along. Some of us are relaxed and laid back, and others are more easily excited. Some of us are driven by our feelings and our intuition. Others are driven more by thoughts, logic, and reason. None of these traits are better or worse than the others. They're just different ways of being human. But it's important to understand how we are wired, because our personalities can impact the way that we know and experience God. If you are more feelings-oriented, you likely experience God through emotions and intuition, and that's great. But if you are more logic-oriented, you likely experience God through thoughts and reason, and that's great too. If I had to guess, I'd say that Gideon and Thomas were pretty logical people. They needed hard evidence in order to believe, and God was okay with that. Being skeptical isn't a character flaw or a lack of faith. When Gideon and Thomas struggled to believe, they humbly asked God for evidence, and God provided it. So what about us? What if we still need evidence in order to believe today? What kind of evidence does God provide? Let's talk about that. So, a couple more questions. What kind of evidence do we have today that would help us believe in the existence of God? What kind of evidence do we have today that would help us believe in the story of Jesus? And where do we see evidence of God in the following areas? Physical sciences, biological sciences, psychological sciences, affective sciences, medicine, mathematics, the arts, and history. When we struggle, instead of punishing, silencing, or getting angry with us, God gives us the evidence we need in order to believe. To believe because we're not sure we have enough evidence. God doesn't shame us for our questions. So as we close with a song, think about all of the evidence God has given you that you may not have noticed.
Letting go of every single dream, I lay each one down at your feet. Every moment of my wandering never changes what you see. I've tried to win this war, I confess. My hands are weary, I need your rest. Mighty warrior, king of the fight. No matter what I face, you're by my side. When you don't move the mountains, I'm needing you to move. When you don't part the waters, I wish I could walk through. When you don't give the answers as I cry out to you, I will trust, I will trust, I will trust in you. Truth is, you know what tomorrow brings. It's not